Welcome to Reformed Thinking, the deep dive.
It's good to be here.
Our mission on this show is, well, it's pretty straightforward. We take sophisticated source material theological texts, dense research, and we try to distill the most crucial structured insights from it.
And today we're looking at material you provided, specifically some key excerpts from Thomas Schreiner's Biblical Theology.
That's right. And our focus is going to be entirely on the remarkable Book of Lamentations.
It's a study that is just so necessary. I mean, Lamentations gets passed over so often, doesn't it?
It does. It's almost treated like a footnote or, a literary appendix to Jeremiah.
When in fact it's this incredibly complex poetic reflection on, well, the single greatest national disaster in ancient Israel's history.
We're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem.
The temple, the loss of their nationhood in 586 BC, all of it. The event that led directly to the Babylonian exile.
So our goal for you today is a structured, thorough understanding of this really unique text. We're not just going to summarize the grief. We want to show how this book, which confronts the reality of total failure, of devastation, it structures its grief so rigorously.
Right.
So rigorously that it leaves you, the reader, with no other choice but to ground all your future hope in one place.
And that's in the absolute sovereign constancy of God.
Exactly.
And you said the key word there, form. The form of this book is not accidental. It is theological through and through.
Right.
And that brings us, I think, right to our first section.
Okay, let's do it. Let's unpack this structure, because for Lamentations, the form is at least half the message. I mean, even its placement in the canon seems so logical.
It really does. It fits right between Jeremiah, who foretold the disaster,
and Ezekiel, who was speaking to the people already in exile.
So Lamentations is the bridge. It's that necessary, anguished literary contemplation of the fulfilled predictions.
It's the moment where they have to sit in the ruins and process the fact that everything the prophets warned about actually happened.
It came to pass. But what's so striking as you study the book is the medium itself. We're not getting a straightforward history lesson here.
No, not at all. It's poetry. Intense, structured poetry.
And that choice is completely deliberate. The source material rightly points out that poetry is selected because it can capture and convey raw, deep emotion in a way that, prose just can't.
It gives the grief a kind of artistic container, a structure that forces the reader to slow down, to pause, to reflect, and really wrestle with the experience being described.
Yes. Poetry just has this singular character that makes it perfect for communicating the extremes of human experience, whether it's the highest joy or, in this case,
the absolute bottom of sorrow.
Prose can give you the facts, the timeline of the siege. But poetry, it transmits the feeling, the disorientation.
And the discipline that's applied to this sorrow is, it's just astonishing. It's not simply poetry.
No.
It's acrostic poetry. For anyone who might need a quick refresher, that means the verses follow the alphabetical order of the language, in this case, the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet.
And the sources are clear that the first 4 chapters follow this incredibly disciplined framework. Each successive verse, or sometimes a set of verses, begins with the next letter of the alphabet.
All the way from Aleph to Tav.
All the way to the end. It's this remarkable piece of literary architecture, especially when you think about the raw chaos it's describing. Why would you impose such rigid order on total chaos?
That's the question, isn't it?
And this structural discipline is, you could argue, the central point of the book's entire theological argument. Scholars like Barry Webb have noted that the acrostic format gives this overwhelming formless grief a specific manageable shape.
A
shape. And that shape in and of itself is a kind of resolution. Yeah. It's the beginning of the healing process.
That makes a lot of sense. Think about deep sorrow. If you don't control it, your mind just circles endlessly.
It obsesses. It returns to the source of the pain over and over, and it can't move past it. It's just incoherent repetition.
So the acrostic is a kind of control mechanism, both theological and psychological. It stops that circling.
It forces a forward sequential progression through the pain. It's like a forced march from A to Z through the valley of the shadow of death. You have to keep moving.
It's designed to let the grief be fully expressed. It has to run its whole alphabetical course.
But at the same time, it sets these very clear, very intentional limits on that sorrow. It contains the anguish inside a divinely ordered structure. The lament isn't just left to run wild, it's anchored.
And the material cites Norman Gottwald on this, who has a really specific insight.
He does. Gottwald is known for his work on biblical lament forms, and he offers this really specific application of this discipline.
Tell us a bit more about his interpretation here.
He argues that this form, the acrostic, it facilitates a complete cleansing of conscience through a total confession of sin.
Okay.
Because the sins of Israel are confessed through this acrostic form, they are literally acknowledged from Aleph to Tav, from A to Z.
So it guarantees a comprehensive, systematic confession of their rebellion against their covenant king.
Exactly. The form itself demands utter thoroughness and repentance. You can't skip a letter. You can't just confess the sins you feel worst about. You have to go through the entire spiritual catalog.
The structure of the poem becomes a spiritual exercise in itself.
That's it.
And that discipline holds, doesn't it? Even when the pattern shifts a little. We see that transition in chapter 5.
We do. Chapter 5 doesn't use the acrostic pattern. It's a more straightforward, non-alphabetical communal lament.
Yeah.
Yet,
As the sources note, it still has 22 verses.
which is the exact number of letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So even when that strict alphabetical discipline is relaxed, the literary framework, that sense of completeness and containment, it's still there. It's absolute.
And all of this careful structuring brings us to the book's climax, what you call the hermeneutical key for understanding the whole thing.
Right. So while the first 4 chapters use the acrostic to catalog all the suffering and confession, chapter 3 just stands apart. Dramatically so.
It's unique in its design.
It is. It's much longer than the others, 66 verses long. And the Hebrew alphabet is used not just once.
But 3 times. Each letter gets 3 verses.
This unusual triple acrostic layout is like a giant flashing sign. It's signaling, unequivocally, that chapter 3 is the emotional, the theological, and the literary center of the entire book.
That triple acrostic is it's amazing. In the middle of the greatest national collapse, the poet imposes the greatest possible structural discipline. Why is that architectural emphasis so critical?
The author is dedicating 3 times the literary real estate and 3 times the discipline to this chapter because it contains the essential truth that will redeem all the suffering that surrounds it.
It's a moment of kind of literary shock. We move from the raw, brutal suffering in chapters 1 and 2, and instead of just spiraling down into total despair,
The poet forces this deep, structured pause right in the middle.
so the structure dictates how we're supposed to interpret the book. The source material is telling us we have to read the whole thing, not from the perspective of that uncertain ending in chapter 5, but from the standpoint of the hope that is so clearly and dramatically laid out in the core of chapter 3.
If you miss those structural signposts, you miss the book's central theological conclusion. Lamentations sets its hope squarely in the middle, in the most highly structured section, not at the end.
The author is making sure that you, the reader, are anchored in God's character before you have to confront the unresolved questions about your own future.
Precisely.
That sets the necessary framework. But to really appreciate the hope in chapter 3, we have to face the disaster the book describes. So let's move to part 2, agonizing judgment at Yahweh's hand.
Yes. To understand the hope, we first have to accept the source of the suffering. And the material is crystal clear on this.
Right.
The book is rooted absolutely in Yahweh's covenant with Israel. This destruction is not random political misfortune.
No, it's covenantal execution.
That is the crucial starting point. The big historical question, why did this happen to us,
Yeah.
is answered immediately and unequivocally. The people violated the stipulations of the covenant.
The covenant from Sinai, that was repeated throughout their history.
Exactly. They failed to submit to God's lordship, to the will of Yahweh, their king. So the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile that followed, they aren't accidents of history.
They are the direct, inevitable, and promised consequences of that rebellion.
And that's why Lamentations works as both a lament and as a comprehensive A to Z confession of sin.
Right.
And the magnitude of this failure is just immense. It pushes the reader right to the edge of asking that ultimate theological question. Has the old covenant failed completely? Is the sinfulness of God's people just too great for the covenant structure to even contain?
The physical suffering forces that confrontation with covenant failure.
It'd have to.
And the depiction of that grief is so visceral, so personal. Jerusalem is personified as a widow among the nations.
Sitting alone, silent, with tears just constantly flowing. No one is left to comfort her. And that widow imagery is so powerful. She's lost her husband, Yahweh, who had pledged fidelity to her. She's lost her status, her protection.
All the symbols of that covenant relationship are just gone. The festivals and feasts are forgotten.
The roads to Zion mourn because nobody comes to the appointed feasts anymore. And her enemies, the ones she might have relied on politically, they're now rejoicing over her destruction. Her supposed allies, became her abusers.
And the judgment falls first on those who should have been leading the nation. The book catalogs the suffering of every part of society, but it starts with the failure of the leadership.
Yes, princes, who should have been these dignified leaders, have lost all their honor and authority. The anointed king himself is dragged off into exile. But it's not just the political elite. The text goes after the religious leaders, too.
The priests and prophets.
They're judged for their own spiritual iniquity. The prophets are specifically called out in chapter 2, verse 14, for speaking soothing words when words of reproof were needed.
They offered false hope.
They did. Their job was to proclaim Yahweh's actual word of judgment, but instead they offered these false assurances of peace and prosperity. They failed in their core duty to shepherd the people toward repentance.
Which makes them complicit in the catastrophe.
Completely. And that's a staggering observation. The divine judgment falls first and hardest on those responsible for spiritual clarity.
And from there, the suffering just spills out into the general population. Elders are dishonored, women are violated, the strong young men are forced into slave labor.
All the markers of national celebration are gone. Dancing, joy, mirth. They're just distant memories. The sound of merriment is gone from the city gates.
And the book does not pull any punches when it gets to the sheer horror of the siege and famine.
No, it doesn't. The text describes children starving to death. They ask for bread, and no one gives it to them. And then you get to the truly shocking accounts, which are there to show the full depth of the covenant curse being fulfilled.
You mean the accounts of mothers?
Yes, accounts of once tender-hearted mothers eating their own children because of the siege. This level of visceral, desperate agony marks the complete breakdown of civilization. It's the terrifying fulfillment of the curses from Deuteronomy 28. It is utter covenantal devastation.
That imagery is so intense. It represents the point of no return, the deepest possible consequence of rejecting God's covenant. But what's really astonishing, given this level of suffering, is how forcefully the author insists that Yahweh himself is the singular source behind all of it.
Yes, and this is the theological linchpin of the whole book. The exile was not fate. It wasn't chance. It wasn't just that Babylon had a better army.
No, the text says Israel sinned grievously.
And the punishment was not arbitrary. The author demands that we see this as righteous. It's an expression of Yahweh's perfect justice. This understanding that God is the active enemy is the only possible path toward any real hope.
And the language used to describe God's action is incredibly violent. It's active. He's the one who inflicted sorrow and fierce anger.
He poured out his hot anger. He left Israel stunned. He gave them into the hands of their enemies. The Lord himself scattered them and inflicted the wound.
He's depicted as stomping on Judah like grapes in a winepress. This isn't divine permission, it's divine action.
It goes way beyond just allowing the disaster to happen. The text says, he actively performed the destruction. He flung Jerusalem from heaven to earth. He broke down Judah's strongholds.
When Israel needed help, the text says Yahweh withdrew his support and became an adversary.
So that he has become like an enemy. He laid his own meeting place, the temple, in ruins. He made Zion forget the festival and the Sabbath. He did exactly what he said he would do. He carried out his word to lay Jerusalem in ruins.
The ferocity is just relentless. It ensures no reader can blame Babylon or fate.
Not a chance.
So if the language is this aggressive, a military attack from God, how do we reconcile that terrifying judgment with the concept of his steadfast love, which comes later? The source material says this judgment is righteous.
And the reconciliation is found in the covenant structure. Because the judgment is the fulfillment of curses that were explicitly laid out in the law, what he ordained and prophesied in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, it is perfectly just.
So God isn't acting randomly.
Not at all. He is acting according to his revealed word and character as a covenant king who upholds his own standards. He has to demonstrate his justice against rebellion, or his entire character collapses.
And that identification of the aggressor continues right into chapter 3, the critical center. Here, the eye is speaking for Israel, and he describes Yahweh as a ravaging animal.
Like a bear and a lion that tore me to pieces. He stretched out his bow and sent arrows against Israel. We are talking about a God who has become actively predatory toward his own people.
What does that shift in metaphor from a military general to a wild animal tell us about how bad the covenant breach was?
I think it indicates the breach was so total that God's relationship with Israel had to fundamentally, if temporarily, reverse itself. The language of the bear and the lion, these creatures of immense, uncontrollable power, it emphasizes how relentless and unavoidable the judgment was.
It's beyond military action. It's like a force of nature.
Yes. And that severity confirms that Israel's rejection of Yahweh's lordship wasn't a minor infraction. It was a capital offense against their king, and it required a violent, full expression of divine wrath.
And recognizing this is critical for understanding the cosmic scope of God's rule. The material mentions scholars like Claus Westermann, who rightly observed that God directs the history of all peoples, not just Israel.
He affects wars, he determines the victors and the vanquished.
Gottwald reinforces that, saying starkly, no accident, no demon, no foreign god was responsible for Israel's plight. It was Yahweh alone.
And the theological conclusion have to be that everything that happens, the apparent good and the perceived bad, calamity and blessing, it all comes from his hand. This is a cornerstone of Reformed thinking, and it's affirmed right here in the heart of this ancient lament.
Which leads directly to that ultimate statement of sovereignty in chapter 3.
Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that good and bad come?
This entire disaster is the perfect, sovereignly executed fulfillment of prophecy.
The comprehensive reach of God's rule is completely affirmed. The Old Covenant people were subjected to the divine judgment they earned, and their suffering was directly proportional to their rebellion.
And the intensity of part 2, that full, painful acceptance that their defeat was Yahweh's doing and was perfectly just.
It's the necessary precursor. It's the only logical path to the sudden shift toward hope we find in the middle of the book. Without absolute acceptance of God's rule and judgment, the hope that follows is just meaningless.
Okay, that context is essential. So now let's make that pivot. Part 3, the unshakable ground of hope. It seems like the worst news possible, that Israel's punishment was the personal expression of Yahweh's fierce anger.
Right. If God is against them, if he's their ravaging enemy, what possible hope could there be?
But the source material just turns this whole idea on its head. It presents this beautiful paradox that shifts the entire tone of the book.
And the paradox is this. The rule of Yahweh in this situation is the only stable basis for hope. Well, if Israel's defeat had just been the result of Babylon's superior army or random political wins, if it were a purely secular, arbitrary event,
They'd be subject forever to the whims of other nations. Their defeat would be final and meaningless.
exactly. If suffering is arbitrary, then despair is the only logical response.
But because their suffering was caused by a covenantal, just, sovereign king,
Precisely. Because they sinned, and because Yahweh was the one who handed them over, he is also the one who has the absolute authority and consistency to reverse their fortunes. He acts according to his character. If he's just in judgment, he must also be constant in love.
so the very thing that inflicted the sorrow of divine sovereignty is revealed to be the only reliable source of salvation.
That's the pivot.
And that requires a very intentional, conscious change in perspective from the author, which we see so vividly in verse 21 of chapter 3.
Yes. Even in the middle of describing Yahweh's unrelenting opposition in the first 20 verses of that chapter, the tone just shifts abruptly when the author remembers the Lord's covenant, and this memory renews his hope.
And this remembering isn't just a casual thought. It's a deliberate spiritual pivot.
It is. It's grounded in the historical constancy of God's revealed character. It forces the author to turn his gaze away from his current painful experience and toward the historical, stable reality of who God is.
Why is memory the catalyst here? Why doesn't the author just, decide to be hopeful?
Because he can't create hope from within himself,
Yeah.
not under these circumstances. Hope has to be external. It has to be anchored in something solid. He is recalling the essential declaration of God's own character given to Moses back in Exodus 34.
The foundation of the Sinai covenant.
Right. By remembering God's own definition of himself, merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, the author finds a certainty that transcends his immediate experience of judgment.
And that act of remembering leads directly to the most famous lines in the entire book.
The affirmation of God's nature is just undeniable. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness.
The judgment was devastating, yes. But it's met and countered by this absolute statement about the eternal covenant nature of the Lord.
The wrath is not eternal. The love is. And this is where the whole book finds its intellectual and theological equilibrium.
And the text then softens the interpretation of the affliction itself, even though the judgment was so complete. It says the Lord does not willingly afflict or grieve the children of men.
That phrasing is so important. It suggests that judgment, while necessary and perfectly righteous, is contrary to his primary disposition toward his creation and his people.
So it's a crucial distinction.
It is. The material explains that God acts, in a way, begrudgingly, regretfully even. He doesn't relish it. If there's no other path toward his higher purposes, securing covenant obedience and demonstrating his justice, he must act in judgment. But his heart isn't in the affliction itself.
He's not defined by wrath, he's defined by steadfast love.
The judgment is a necessary means to restore covenant obedience, but it is not the ultimate end of his relationship with his people.
So, if the judgment is this righteous necessity, this bitter medicine, how should the people under it respond? What's the proper posture?
The proper posture is to bear it humbly and hopefully. The suffering itself becomes instructional. It is good for a person to bear the yoke in his youth.
The author encourages waiting on God.
Yes, the Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. And this waiting isn't passive resignation. It's an active, hopeful seeking of God, even while under the oppression of his punishing hand. It's active submission to the discipline of the Father.
And what about their identity? I mean, they've lost their king, their temple, their land, their sovereignty. After all that devastation in 586 BC, is their identity as God's people still secure?
Absolutely. The author is confident that the Lord will not cast off forever and that Yahweh remains Israel's portion.
And to call God your portion means what exactly?
It means that even if you lose every tangible asset, land, wealth, health, the source of your life and identity remains secure. Despite all appearances of rejection, God's people remain God's people. Their confidence rests entirely on the unshakable, self-consistent nature of Yahweh's justice and love.
So his constancy is the guarantee that these defeats, no matter how severe, are not the final word.
Because sovereign grace stands behind them and beyond them. The covenant promise holds, even when the covenant stipulations are broken and judged.
Yes, and that grounding in divine constancy is what allows the author to then appeal to the king.
Which brings us logically into part 4, resolution and anticipation.
Right. Because even while he's describing all these woes in the first few chapters, there are these short, interjected prayers sprinkled throughout.
He's summoning Yahweh to come to their aid. The belief that God can act never dies.
We see these desperate short prayers like, "O Lord, behold my affliction."
For the enemy has triumphed. And look, O Lord, for I'm in distress. The author is appealing directly to Yahweh's mercy and his character. He believes the Lord will intervene when he sees the suffering of his beloved, disciplined people.
The very act of appealing assumes his sovereignty hasn't been abandoned.
No, it's just been applied through judgment.
And that belief system really culminates in chapter 5, which is presented as one long communal prayer to the Lord.
Yes. The author calls on the Lord to remember his people and to see our disgrace. This appeal, though, is not based on their own worthiness.
Which they've already admitted is zero.
Exactly. It's based on one thing and one thing only, the fact that the Lord reigns.
The author states the key premise of his whole appeal. But you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations.
And that's the key argument of the final prayer. If God reigns forever, how can he possibly forget his people or the promises he made to them?
The appeal is for restoration. Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old.
The logic is circular, in a way, but it's self-reinforcing within the context of sovereignty. The same king who justly destroyed them is the only one capable of justly renewing them.
We did note earlier that the book ends on a note of tension, or at least an open question. After that fervent plea for renewal, the author asks, is the Lord so angry he will never show mercy again?
He does. It leaves the reader hanging. And this is why that structural analysis we did in part 1 is so vital. We can't give that final, desperate human question undue weight.
Chapter 3 is still the hermeneutical key.
It has to be. The author leaves the reader pondering the future. Their sin is grievous, they don't deserve redemption, but the overall message is anchored not in human merit or human despair, but in God's faithfulness, as articulated in the center of the book.
The hope is secure, even if the timing is unknown.
That's it. And part of that anticipated restoration involves justice for the enemies who carried out Yahweh's judgment.
The sources highlight the author's confidence in Yahweh's sovereignty to judge Israel's adversaries as well.
It's a necessary piece of the theological puzzle. The author is confident that Yahweh will repay them and that his curse will be upon them, destroying them from under his heavens.
And this isn't just a call for vindictive prayer.
No, it's a theological statement that God is directing the history of all nations. He used Babylon as his instrument of wrath, and when Babylon has completed its appointed task, God will judge the instrument itself for its pride and violence.
And there's a specific focus on Edom.
Yes, the cup of God's wrath, which Israel has drunk, is promised next to Edom, and the promised judgment of the enemies signals the expected reversal.
God's punishment of Zion has ended, and the exile is expected to be over.
It affirms that the Lord's anger is temporary, but his rule over both Israel and the nations is eternal.
So if Lamentations forces us to confront this terrible reality of the wrath of God and establishes that wrath as a righteous expression of covenant justice, where does that confrontation lead? Where does this old covenant agony find its ultimate resolution?
Well, the material makes it clear that Lamentations creates a problem so catastrophic covenant failure under a holy sovereign God that it closes the door on any resolution less than the one the New Testament finally provides.
The agony and desolation of standing under God's wrath.
So powerfully communicated by Jerusalem the widow finds its historical and theological apex in the suffering of Jesus the Christ.
How does that connect specifically?
Israel suffered the consequences of covenant curses for their own sin. Jesus, on the cross, experienced the ultimate covenant curse and the full extent of being forsaken by God.
The desolation in Lamentations 1.12, is there any sorrow like my sorrow?
That's the voice of the covenant people under God's judgment. And that judgment was poured out completely upon the Son on the cross. He fully entered into the experience of covenant judgment.
And the call within Lamentations for Israel to bear judgment humbly and hopefully, that anticipates the Isaianic servant of the Lord. Israel's corporate suffering points forward to a greater fulfillment in the true Israel.
Yes, the sufferings of Israel on the world, all rooted in human sin, were ultimately experienced by the true Israel, the servant of the Lord. But there's a vital distinction here, one that's consistent with our Reformed understanding, and that is, Israel was under judgment for its own sin. The servant willingly bears suffering, but he does so substitutionarily for the sins of his people. Jesus stands in the place of Israel, absorbing the covenant curses, the bear, the lion, the arrows, that Lamentations details so brutally. He became the widow and the afflicted.
Therefore, the forgiveness they plead for and the hope that persists through these deep sorrows and lamentations. It finds its final and complete resolution not in Jerusalem's political restoration in the 6th century BC,
No.
but in the sufferings and glories of Jesus Christ. The hope anchored in this ancient lament reaches its absolute goal in the resurrection.
That's the ultimate theological conclusion. Lamentations chronicles covenant departure and the divine judgment that results, yet paradoxically, it provides this undeniable evidence that the same sovereign God who punishes his people is the only stable source of salvation for them.
The certainty of God's righteous wrath.
Clearly laid out in those first 4 chapters, is matched only by the certainty of his steadfast love and constancy. And this guarantees that judgment is temporary, but his faithfulness is, indeed, new every morning.
That is a crucial structured insight into a book that's often misinterpreted. We see here the discipline of the poet forcing the discipline of the reader, driving us to find hope outside our circumstances and only in God's character.
That's it.
So if the ultimate calamity, the failure of the old covenant through sin, was orchestrated by a sovereign God, yet it led to the greatest revelation of his mercy in Christ, what does that tell you about the nature of God's plan, even in the midst of your own grievous sorrows? Ponder how the disciplined structure of this ancient lament guides us away from despair and toward reliance on that absolute covenantal faithfulness.
A good thought to end on.
Thank you for sharing your sources and letting us unpack the architecture of disciplined grief with you in this deep dive. Until next time.